Hey Scott, I just put you on mute for a sec. You gotta take yourself off when we talk. I'll remind you. Okay, I'm gonna start in a couple minutes. Hello, 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 Internet world. This is the Carmen Branje Show. I am Carmen Branje. Welcome to the show. Thank you for tuning in during the hopefully tail end of this COVID crisis. I guess you can see I'm a hat guy now. I wasn't a hat guy always, but you can see what the COVID crisis has done to me. I had to resort to shaving my head bald, and it's sort of I got it real close. I got it down to a 1, but it grows really fast, and it's sort of like a 2 now. So it's sort of I got to wear a hat, otherwise I look kind of moronic. But you know what? That's basically the worst of it, and that's the last I'm going to mention COVID in today's episode, because I'm sure you're all sick to death of hearing and thinking about that stuff. Today, what we're going to talk about today is a very exciting, well, for me anyways, and I think generally an exciting topic, is accessibility. So I think accessibility sometimes gets a bad rap in that it's maybe a little boring or something. But I think it's the exact opposite. I think accessibility. So accessibility means making sure that differently abled people can use your design, right? And that could be somebody who we traditionally think of being disabled, or, that's sort of an arbitrary line where we say, oh, you're abled and you're disabled. There's a spectrum, right? Like, am I disabled when compared to an NBA basketball player? Sort of, right? There's a lot of stuff they can do that I can't do. So I think there's two awesome things for accessibility. One, you get to work on really crazy and challenging challenges, right? You get to solve problems that are really, can be really hard to solve. And two, you're directly helping people who need help. So I think that's a double whammy. In my books. And so I've worked in accessibility for a while, and I've invited my good friend George Zamfir on to the show today. So we go way back to the aughts when we tied an onion around our belt. So we go back to the mid to late aughts when we worked at a research lab in Ryerson University. And we've recently crossed paths again. We're both now working at Loblaw Digital. George is the new director of accessibility at Loblaw. So he's going to come on the show, and he's going to tell us about his experience as as an accessibility specialist. He has quite a resume. He's been around at Facebook and Slack, and now Loblaw Digital. So pretty decent resume. And he's been around the block. So we're going to talk about accessibility and how it relates to design. And of course, our good friend Scott is here, and we're gonna introduce the topic. We're going to kind of chit chat before we bring George on, and maybe lay out a framework for the discussion, and then we're gonna bring everybody back. So what do you think? Should we start the show? Let's start the show. Alrighty. Welcome back. So again, we have George Zamfir. He's the new director of accessibility at Loblaw Digital on the show today. We're going to talk about his experience with accessibility. But before I bring on the guests on, I want to talk about accessibility a little bit. I think it gets not a bad rap, but I don't think it gets the proper acknowledgement as being a really exciting field to work in. So I want to show you some of the work that George and I worked on while we were at a laboratory at Ryerson called the Inclusive Media and Design Center, and that lab was directed. So it's a research lab at a university in Toronto. And the director, my supervisor, her name was Dr. Deborah Fell. So we did all sorts of really, really interesting research and exploration around how to provide accessibility to people with sensory disabilities to media, right? So to video, to audio, to music, to all these things. So, when you think about accessibility, you might think it's sort of a technical practice or discipline, but really I see accessibility at its root almost as a pure art form. Okay? Bear with me. What do I mean by that? So I think at least a big part of art is being able to translate information across modes, right? Being able to capture an emotion in song, right? How is that? Like, a song is different from emotion, right? But you could see how you could have a happy song or a sad song, right? And so you're sort of, you're crossing the modes and you're translating from mode to mode, right? Or let's say if you were going to make, I guess we'll stick with visual. So if a painting, a scary painting or a sad painting, or even a lot of times we don't go from emotion to the art form. We switch. So, a lot of times you use descriptor words for other modes. In, let's say, music, you might say, oh, that sounds rough. Right? Well, rough is like something you touch, right? It's not necessarily something you hear. Or that's smooth jazz, right? How can sound be smooth? Smooth is a audio, something you use to describe audio. So in my mind, I think there's a lot of opportunity for artists to get involved in accessibility and figure out what's the best way to translate information between modes. Okay, so I want to let's just talk a little bit briefly about this lab that I worked at. So it was called the Inclusive Media and Design Center, and I started working there as an undergrad in the early aughts under the direction of Dr. Deborah Fells. And I really got excited about my career in design and development because of working here. So we did all sorts of really cool projects. Let me see if I can call up some of the cool things that we did here. Where did we go? Home. Let's see here. Research publications, annual report, resources. Where's the research? There we go, right at the top, right? So all sorts of cool projects around audio description, right? So audio description is kind of like captioning, but for the blind. So audio description, again, this is one of those translations. You're translating a visual scene, like let's say a fight scene, where there's no dialogue to carry forward the story. So audio description is a way to translate from the visual into the audio, right? We're switching domains, okay? And there's somewhat of there's some artistic judgment involved in that. So we did stuff with closed captioning. We did stuff with actually interface that supports intimate contact, like sex, literally sex, right? So how cool and interesting is that? We did stuff around vibrotactile interfaces, which I'll talk about a little bit more too. I could talk about that all day, but I want to get our guests on pretty soon. That was actually what my thesis was related to. So tons of really interesting research projects, and we published a lot of papers. I did maybe 5 or somewhere between 5 and 10 papers was what am I on here. So here, Branje. We looked at, so this was a cool one. I actually have a chart that I want to show you that we did. Okay. So let me show you some of the work we did. So when I first started there, we were looking at doing work for closed captioning, right? So I'm sure you've all seen closed captioning. It's something that sighted people use as well, right? If they go to the gym or if you're in a noisy place or something like that. So what we did is we looked at captions like traditional captions like this, right? Just white text on a black background that doesn't really, it doesn't convey anything beyond the content of the words. But what about, did they say, hey, good job? Or did they say, hey, good job? Right? That little inflection in how you say it totally changes the meaning. And that's missing from captions. So what we did, we tried a few things. One thing that we tried to do is try and put more emotion into the display of the captions, right? So we highlighted the captions, we put a little icon. So I think this was for, I forget. See, it's a little difficult. Even looking at it now, I forget what emotion it was. This is probably maybe happy, but the icon doesn't look happy. Here's another example here. Oh yeah, this was so loving, right? And the purpose of this was some CBC short that we worked with the producers on this to create this type of description. So this whole scene was about how this couple, they were getting married, they were so loving, but the thing was, it was sarcastic, right? They were saying the words and the feelings were incongruent. So what we were trying to do is convey that emotion so that they could get the joke, right? Basically. So we did some research into that to see how people would respond to that, and what sort of information they got out of that. Then moving beyond that, so even we felt, okay, this is okay, but there's still a lot missing. Right? So what we tried to do, and also we're doubling up on the visual mode, right? You're trying to watch the movie and then you're trying to read and see all these visual things. So what we did is we looked at something else. We looked at using we had the whole body available, right? All of the skin that's available to intercept sound, right? Sound information. So what we did is we developed a chair that would convey sound information through vibrotactile stimulation, right? So this is one of the versions. It had actuators in the back and it had actuators on the arm and air jets, and it kind of shook around, right? Here's another version of different versions, right? We prototyped a ton. We tried all sorts of things. Even our earliest version was we just strapped speakers to someone's back and tried that, right? And the whole purpose of that, what we were trying to do is basically treat the back like the cochlea. So you have something in your ear called a cochlea, and in your cochlea there's a place to frequency mapping, right? Little hairs are responsible for certain frequencies. So we were trying to do that, albeit much more coarse, but on your back. So we would present high frequencies at the top and low frequencies at the bottom, right? And what we were trying to do is convey emotional information to the participants. And let me tell you a quick story about how this would sort of work. So for example, I was watching Apollo 13 with a deaf colleague of mine at the lab. We were both sitting in the chairs and we were watching Apollo 13, the scene where they're launching into space, right? And you could hear and feel the noise of the rocket, right? And you could feel it in the chair. Now that is not normally conveyed through captioning, right? So normally my deaf friend would have not experienced that, right? And then there's a scene, they get into space and they cut the engines and everything goes quiet all of a sudden. And she turned to me and was like, wow, that was really cool, right? Because she got exactly what was going on without having to have the caption there, right? So that's an example of how we were able to give access to part of the film that they normally did not have access to. Here's just another quick experiment we did where we showed people scary movies, right, with different amounts of sound, either no sound or some vibration, and then vibration and sound. And what you can see is that as we started to add the vibration of the movie, and they could feel the scary music, their physical response, we measured their galvanic skin response, was higher, right? It changed more if they had vibration versus silence, which is, you kind of know this already. If you've ever watched a horror film with no sound, it's not scary, right? So that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to bring forward that feeling, or that emotion, right? That you would not get that scary feeling if you just put in a closed caption, scary music plays. It doesn't make you scared, right? Okay, and one quick video I want to show you. This is a really, really cool example of cross-modal translation. So this is something, this has been around for a while. This is called the tongue camera. And the way it works, I'll just give a quick intro and then show just a quick clips of the video, is a blind person would put a camera on their head somewhere, mounted on glasses or on a helmet, and then on their tongue, they put on an array of electrodes that basically vibrate based on the pixels of the camera. And what is, as far as I understand, is after a while, through what's called active perception, because people are moving around, they actually see. Like the information is mapped to their visual cortex. So let's just take a look at the video really quickly and see what can be done with this technology.
Even those who are congenitally profoundly blind still form a mental image in their mind of the scene around them. They use their sense of touch, in some cases echolocation, and also, of course, the tip of their cane or their seeing eye dog to form that mental image. Our technology, the BrainPort, uses a video camera, a streaming video camera, mounted on a pair of glasses and processed through our computer, and then we display that information on the tongue of the person with an electrode array of 400 tactors. And using this additional information, besides what they can get from their cane or their sense of touch, the profoundly blind person learns to enhance the image, the mental image that they have of the scene around them. Our technology is FDA cleared. It was one of 3 de novo clearances in this last year.
Okay, I'm going to zoom ahead to the demos. Okay, here is
Let me show you
being
Kevin.
in use. Okay, so this is a profoundly blind person. Blind from birth.
Kevin is 42 years old in Madison, and he's profoundly blind since birth. And he has worked with us to develop this technology from a user point of view. Some of the benefits of this technology are to increase mobility, to enhance independence for people who are profoundly blind.
Okay, so you guys get the point. I was going to show you a different video. There's a few interesting news clips. I didn't want to play it on YouTube because they're pretty, they will kill you for copyright infringement. But just go, if you're interested in that, go and Google tongue camera, and there's videos of blind people throwing balls into bins and all sorts of things. And it really speaks to brain plasticity and how your brain can rewire itself and you know, adapt itself to new sensory input, right? Okay, so I could talk all day about this stuff. Like I said, like this stuff is crazy interesting. How can people seeing through their tongue, that doesn't blow your mind? Like that's amazing stuff, right? So we could talk about this all day, but I want to bring on our first guest, Mr. Scott Sears. Scott, is you there? Unmute. I muted you.
Yeah, I'm
there
here.
You go. Alrighty, we are with Scott, Mr. Sears. How are you doing, sir?
Good, man. How you doing?
I'm well.
Just on regards to that, your video there. I mean, just think it's not even about accessibility anymore. If you think about virtual reality and augmented reality, it's just about touching into those extra sensories. You know, those not extra senses, those senses that normally you wouldn't get from just a movie. So.
Right.
Exactly. Very interesting video.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, I think at the lab too, we kind of took the approach that we didn't necessarily think what we were building was only for disabled people who had disabilities, right? We took somewhat of a universal design approach for example, we worked with video description, right? Which is mostly for blind, like it's meant for blind people, but just like closed captioning is useful to people who can hear, so is video description. Like, wouldn't you like to have your favorite show video described so you could have it on a podcast or something while you drive? Things like that, right? I think a lot of it's just expanding your mindset a little bit to look at the bigger picture, you know?
Sure, for sure. Bringing the better experience, really. I mean, whatever media you're viewing it through.
Yeah, exactly. And so there, I don't know. Have you ever heard of the curb cut effect?
No.
So it's I don't know what you would call it, a concept. So a lot of people are aware of this in accessibility. So you know how curbs in the 60s, they were like 3 inches high, right? To go from the street to the sidewalk, right?
Yeah.
But we cut that out now. Now I think, I don't know, I haven't looked this up, but I think that was done with people in wheelchairs in mind, right? But those help everybody. Anybody with a wheeled device now is helped, right? Or even if you're, let's say you're a senior citizen, you can't lift your leg that high. That helps you too, right? So I think sometimes we should look at accessibility and open up the purview, right? So remember I was saying how the line between abled and disabled is sort of arbitrary. You have this spectrum of ability, and somewhere in there you put this line in and you say, okay, you people are disabled, you people are enabled. I think we should just think about it as think the whole spectrum, right? And then just always keep that in mind, right? It's not really about, right? What do you think?
That's interesting stuff, eh?
Yeah. I mean, so what's your experience been with accessibility? Because I think it didn't really come to the forefront in UX design till maybe like the 2010s when it really started to get widespread.
Yeah. When you think about that stuff from a design perspective, I mean, you're looking at contrast issues, making sure things are easily identifiable. Designs for different viewport sizes. There's I mean, all kinds of things that you would design for, but especially when you bring up your chair example and stuff like that, it's really just kind of scraping the surface of what really needs to be done. So my experience has actually been pretty light in comparison, but very interesting. I'm actually hoping to learn some stuff.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Well, I think maybe we should bring on George. He's been hanging back, waiting very patiently, and I think maybe he'll come on and agree or disagree with some of my spiel. But what do you think? Should we bring him on?
Let's bring him on.
All right, and we'll talk to you in a sec, Scott.
Yeah, all good.
All right. So George, are you there?
Hey, I'm here.
All right. George, how are you, my friend? I haven't seen you in decades.
Yeah. The whole talk about the lab and the research that we're doing and stuff, that brings me back. And the projects that you were on were hardware and software, and I thought that was much cooler. Are you allowed to say on this podcast what we actually call the emoji chair?
What? I don't know. Was that? What did we actually call it?
Oh, you can't tell me that. Weren't you the lead on the project? Didn't we call it like the Orgasmatron or something like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we did. There was some exploration in that direction, right? When you're sitting on a vibration machine, it's hard for your mind not to go into those areas, right? But I mean, the hardware and software combo was that really just really got my interest going, right? And that's kind of why I stuck around and do a PhD, right? Because it was just so fun. I built a keyboard, right? And it was so much fun building and writing software and having people come in and doing research and stuff. And that was probably one of the best times of my life working at that lab.
Yeah, let me tell a quick story about that lab, because that was literally my start in accessibility, and I didn't even know what that thing was. I don't even know if you know the story. I promise it's a cool one. When I applied for the job at the lab, I was doing computer science. I think I was in my second or third year, and then I realized that I was going to graduate myself and a few other thousand computer science students, and we're all fighting over the same jobs at a few companies. So when I found this job, and it was my first job in the field, so actually doing any sort of programming, was that was the first thing, because before then I was going to classes to count students or something. I can't remember, some campus job. But I didn't tell Deb. So Deborah Fells, who was our supervisor and director of the lab, and an amazing human. She and yourself, I think both of you guys interviewed me.
Yeah.
And you gave me the job. What I forgot to tell Deb was that I wasn't actually allowed to have that job, because that job was for Canadian students. It was for a work study kind of thing. And then I said, hey, Deb, I'm actually an international student at this point. I'm not sure I can have. And Deb was like, it's okay. I have the funding. I can afford your $15 an hour or whatever it was.
Yeah. She's pretty easy about, like, you know, documented rules. Status and stuff. Yeah, rules. I mean, that's the whole point of a lab like that, right? Is you're breaking rules and doing weird shit, right? So, yeah, it was good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So tell me, you had kind of an interesting journey once you left the lab. So you have a pretty cool resume. So tell us about, so you went to Facebook. Was that directly from the lab in there, or was there something before that?
No, you were spot on that accessibility was not really much in the spotlight. There weren't really any
just like government sites maybe were accessible. That was about it.
It was basically academia and government that was doing accessibility. So after I graduated, there were no jobs in accessibility that I could find. I worked in my second passion, which is the energy industry. I was working for the small startup that at the time was just founded to manage all the consumption data in Ontario and conservation of energy and better use of energy through data. Anyways, it was kind of cool. But then I still kept an eye on accessibility. And my first job after that was actually at Scotiabank. Another amazing human, Monica Ackerman and Pina Dintino. They were running the accessibility team at Scotiabank, and they posted this position. I was probably the least qualified for it, but as they told me later, we thought you had some potential. So, and then I started at Scotiabank, and 2 weeks into the job, they said, hey, so we're redesigning the online banking experience. You're it.
All right.
So it was baptism by fire, but it was awesome. You mentioned a bunch of names, whether it's Scotiabank or Facebook or TELUS Digital or Slack, it doesn't matter. The accessibility is all the same across industries. There are some specific problems that are, specific to one industry, where it's really more about products than about industry. So if you have a video product, your focus is much more on captions, audio descriptions, something like Netflix or something like that.
Yeah.
But for the most part, accessibility is basically providing people with disabilities access to your products. And the challenge is kind of the same. There's legislation for it. Ontario has the AODA, which legislates what products should be like. There's similar legislation in the States, European Union, you name it. So it's kind of the same. There's only one standard for accessibility called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's kind of the same. The journey has been all over the place. But the work that I've been doing has been twofold. Either actually being part of the team building accessible products. So the online banking platform, you were mentioning, a bunch of disabilities. If you're a screen reader user, which is text to speech, and you're going in to pay your bill, but we don't read the form fields properly, they're not labeled properly, and instead of paying $20, you pay $20,000. That's a problem that you can't afford to have, especially when it comes to something like banking. So yeah, man, it's been really interesting. I can also talk about this forever, but I can't. Okay. I don't know if you have pointed more specific questions.
Yeah, no, I got a few. So whenever someone asks me what's accessibility, I sort of sum it up this way. So let me know if it's overly simplistic. I say, and this is basically for digital websites, apps, things like that. There's two things, basically. It's, can a screen reader access all of the elements and read them properly? And can you use the product with a keyboard? Is that basically Like, I mean, of course, there's now a whole bunch of details underneath that follow, but is that basically the crux of it?
Um, there is more than that. And if you go through all of WCAG 2 guidelines,
Yeah.
there's a whole lot. Basically, it's semantic markup, and the semantic markup. A form field has a label. You can get to it by keyboard. The reason there are standards for how to do those things is because your web page or your digital product gets translated into what every operating system has, which is basically an accessibility API. And then when you plug in something like a screen reader or a Braille display or any sort of assistive device, those devices read from the API. And if your stuff is not accessible in all those ways, screen reader, keyboard, semantic markup, whatever, then people basically can't get that data, literally cannot read it. But yeah, I also like to abstract WCAG away a little bit into plain English. I call them accessibility success criteria, but basically requirements for building product.
Yeah.
The design stuff, because you're talking about design earlier, I actually think that accessibility starts in design, and a lot of problems are solved if the design spec or mock-up accounts for it. So I'll give you an example.
Okay.
You build a keyboard experience, like I said, to pay your bill. You go through a bunch of screens, you enter some data, you press some buttons. The reason keyboard is so important is because across the wide spectrum of disabilities, keyboard is arguably the most important, accessibility feature
Or
to
some
support.
kind of button. So it could be a joystick or a button thing, but it's not a mouse. It's not basically not a mouse, right?
Yeah, yeah. So there are many input devices. I'm using
Yeah.
keyboard as, sort
Yeah,
of
yeah.
describe all of them, but I'm
Sure.
obviously not doing it justice.
Yeah.
But the reason non-mouse input is important, um, is because across all these disabilities, people need keyboard. If you're blind, you can't use the mouse. You have to use the keyboard. If you have mobility impairment, et cetera, et cetera. Imagine a design spec where you actually design the keyboard flow. So you press enter on this button, this menu opens, your focus goes here. You press enter, you got an error message. Oh, we need to move focus to that error message because if you're blind, you can't see it.
Right.
So actually, this is the thing that I've been pushing for the last few years. And I know some of my peers across a few companies are also doing the same, which is you spec the accessibility experiences and you get rid of all that confusion when it comes to launching a product. Like, does it work by keyboard? Does it not work by what does the screen reader read? You're basically trying to avoid all these questions and answer them as early as possible. I call that front-loading accessibility within the product development process.
Okay.
And it's amazing. It's amazing because like I said, you solve a lot of these challenges in design, and it's one source of truth, and everybody's clear on what needs to be done and what the experience should be like.
Because I've always seen it as sort of, let's say, design dev. In my mind, it seems it's like 20 or 30% design. And I think a lot of the, like 70 or 80% of the work is on the develop side. Like, so for on design, you kind of have contrast, right? Font size, and that's kind of it until, so let's say what you just said is bring in, so now I'm going to, as a designer, I'm going to indicate the tab order, let's say, or I'm going to indicate what should get focused. So but I think a lot of the work beyond that, like area tags and stuff, the developers got to actually put that in, right?
I'll disagree slightly with that.
Okay.
So first of all, don't put tab indexes on
Oh no.
stuff. Like,
Okay.
no, no. I'll tell you why.
Okay.
I would flip that around. I would say the fact that so I would say that 60-70% of the work is on the design side, and that doesn't mean you do the work. I mean we spec the accessibility experience in design, and then implementation. I mean, implementation is going to take as much as it needs, but one subtle thing that you solve when you spec these accessibility experiences is that accessibility gets despecialized. All of a sudden, we don't have to have our design spec and then this special spec for this special thing called accessibility. It's all in one thing. So how menus open, where focus goes, what it looks like when you tab, the color contrast considerations, those are now spec'd, and it's part of the the spec, the requirement. So it's a subtle thing, but it specializes accessibility a bit. And the ARIA stuff that you mentioned, I don't know if we should tell people, ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. So basically anything that is built fairly modern does not map directly to HTML. So for example, there's no HTML element dialogue, right? Dialogues are things that we invented over time. And how do you make a dialogue accessible? HTML, by the way, native HTML by itself is accessible. You have a text box, you have a button, whatever. That comes with some free accessibility, like keyboard accessibility, screen reader, and so on. If when you start doing some custom stuff, you lose some of that, so you have to build it back in. ARIA is basically there to plug that gap and say, I want to indicate that this dialogue is a dialogue, and don't move focus behind it because a keyboard user might get lost. Read it to a screen reader like this, read a heading for a dialogue, and all that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. Because I guess even if the effort is 2080 design development, the designers, I think, they're still specifying the stuff. And then, of course, the developers implement it, basically. But
yeah.
So you're saying it's more even than I'm suspecting.
Yeah, I think so. And to be honest, this is the first time I'm thinking about it in terms of percentages, because the best product out there in terms of accessibility, I think of them as being just a collaboration through and through. And at least that's how I've been working. But there's the best products that are an intersection of cutting edge, but also accessible, but also beautifully designed, usually account for all these things. Apple comes to mind as an example of that. I can't remember when I read this, but I think it was a technical paper from an Apple engineer who, after Apple launched their Apple Watch, then they realized that this is not really tracking well for people in wheelchairs. Because what's the concept of a step if you're in a wheelchair, counting steps and so on. So he was working on basically making sure that the Apple Watch is useful for people in wheelchairs as well, and track movement and track that kind of stuff. That to me is the perfect mix of design and engineering. So yeah, I see it as a collaboration through and through.
Okay, excellent. So one more topic before we bring old Scott back on. So for those that don't know, there's a concept called universal design, right? Mm-hmm. Where and correct me if I'm wrong, but the general approach is that if you're going to design something, let's say you're going to design a water fountain, you want to design it so that it works for a guy who's 7'2", and a guy who is 5'4", and a kid, and maybe a dog, maybe somebody in a wheelchair, right? It's you're building one thing that works for everybody, right? I don't know if that works beyond the most simplest things. Like, let's take, for example, Amazon or some kind of e-commerce site. Very complex, right? Menus, all that stuff. And what we're trying to do with screen readers is try and shoehorn a visual thing into an audio domain, whereas maybe we should forget the universal design thing and focus on, so like a Google Assistant. I don't know if you use Alexa or any of that stuff now. That's more of from the very beginning, it's an audio interface, right? So what do you think about that? Like universal design, trying to make your website work for everyone versus maybe we should have a visual interface and an audio interface, right, separately. What do you think about that?
Yeah, man, there are a bunch of questions in that one thing, but
yeah, okay, we'll try and
Yeah, we'll tease them out.
Okay.
So I think universal design is definitely falling off from favor, basically. Um, and and your definition is spot on. So that's exactly
Okay.
what you know.
Right.
What's and the curb cut effect could be an example of that. You cut the curbs for one
Okay.
person or one
Right. But it's a curb,
people
right?
work with, but it's for
It's not
everyone.
it's not a website with like
Yeah.
50,000 moving parts.
Yeah.
You know?
So I agree. And you'll have inclusive design advocates, so not universal design, but inclusive design advocates that who will tell you that at some point you need to offer some customization to people because there aren't. If you think of two blind people, there's no such thing as two blind people that are the same. I'll give
Right.
you one example, but like 10 come to mind. So one example is in WCAG, there's a guideline for the minimum color contrast that you should have so that people can see, buttons or text or whatever. So you can have light gray on dark gray because it's hard to read, but it doesn't say what the maximum is. And you'll have people with different visual impairments who cannot read super high contrast text
Hmm.
because it's just jarring for them. And on the other spectrum, you have people who have, and so those people prefer a more
Muted.
smooth or lower
Mm.
contrast. And then you have people who literally cannot read anything that is low contrast.
Yeah.
So at that point, you should be able to say, okay, let's have a smart default. Let's have an experience that we think is as accessible as possible. And you find that through research. And the best way, like user research, and the best way to do that is to have research with actual people with disabilities. Um, and then you have smart defaults, and then you provide customization. One thing that I worked at Slack helped with really was dark mode. So having dark mode in the product, either on mobile or desktop, one of the goals with dark mode was to have a smart default and then let people customize it. Um, so universal design, I think it's harder and harder to do, especially as now we're waking up that people's abilities are different. You guys were talking about abilities at the beginning of this. There's one really cool expression. And inclusive design advocates like really internalize that, which is that most of us, 90 something percent of us, are just temporarily abled.
Right.
Because if you think about it, eventually all of us are going to get a disability. Even if it's a temporary disability, you break your arm shoveling snow or
Yep.
whatever, you
Yep.
spraying something, or it's a situational disability. My wife was pregnant. She would have a hard time climbing any stairs. So
Yep.
that curb cut effect, the ramps, all of a sudden they're not, oh, it's just for those people. It's
Yeah.
not for these people. It's like, no, it's a spectrum. And unless you're
Yep.
really, really lucky human and you have good genetics, most likely you're going to need that. And what I add on top of that is imagine you sell a product to customers, or you want your customers, to log into Shoppers or Scotiabank or whatever, and they can't pay their bill because they broke their hand, because they can't use the app with one hand. You have buttons all over the place and you have to use them everywhere. They
Yep.
can't pay their bill because they can't use the mouse, even for 2 days, right?
Yep.
So that's how I usually think about it. To be honest, I worked compared to other folks in accessibility. I haven't been really doing this for that long of a time, but even I lost my patience to, make the business case for accessibility, or why is this? It's only this percent of people. It's 5-10%. If you go and talk to the most popular apps or companies out there, and they always work hard to acquire new customers, this is one of those ways where you get at least 15% of customers just because you have an accessible experience. So 15%
Yeah.
extra customers is huge for, I
I'll
don't
take
know,
that.
Netflix, anybody really.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it goes back to just that mindset is like not thinking necessarily about that arbitrary able disabled line. It's just you got to think about all the humans, right? That's what we do. We build stuff for humans. Let's just always think of all of them. Doesn't matter like where that line is, because we got to get them all in, right? So
Yeah, and this is, earlier I made a point about design, solving a lot of problems in design.
yeah.
I faked being a designer for a while.
It's easy, man.
Which,
You just got to
which
wear a funny hat. You got to wear a funny hat and dress fancy and dress like a hipster or something, and everyone's like, "Oh, there's the designer."
yeah, yeah. Um,
Well, speaking of
well,
designers,
I joined,
let's get Scott back in the convo, and we'll keep this going. So
yeah.
let's see here. Boom. We got a three-way going. Scott, are you still there? You unmuted?
Yeah. Actually, I got a question for you, George, because it's nice to hear all this that's going on, that you're able to focus on this. I did some, is it WCAG, WCAG? Is that how they say it? I did some, I used a testing software to test a website that I was doing it on, and I found a commonality between that test and the heuristics of doing a heuristic evaluation of a product as well. Like if you think about, I remember when I saw a Xerox heuristic evaluation once. I was looking for a template way back in the day. This was like a while ago, and I found an old Xerox one, and they were talking about the one of the main things I thought at the time was how dated it was. Like because they were talking about photocopiers, right? And they were talking about if the UI device, or not the UI, if the display was not broken or something, how does the user still get it done with the keyboard, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all these things about cursor, being accessible and stuff like that. So it was really interesting. So saying all that, and now where we are today, like now we have experts like you that focus on that sort of thing. What kind of advice would you give to somebody who works at a team that doesn't have the luxury of having someone like you, but is working on important products? I say that for myself. Where I work, we have a UX team, we have this, but we don't have accessibility. Accessibility is, like you said, we capture it in design, and we're a strapped team as well. So you know how that works at the end of the day, and what gets cut from that fat. So what kind of advice would you give to somebody in those kind of situations, as far as tools or ways to even talk to your stakeholders to convince them on that,
Yeah, awesome question. I'm yet to meet a company that has sufficient resources for accessibility, even when they're dedicated accessibility people and teams.
You wear many hats, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So what I would start with, I have a big focus on accessibility as an experience. So think of it less as retroactive. We build something, let's test it. Do we have any bugs? Because that implies that you might not have bugs, and you can't do accessibility by accident. Yeah. It's like performance or security or anything else. You just can't do it by accident. So what I usually recommend people is to start with the core functionality or the core, offering of their product or website or whatever, and just focus on that being accessible. And you can define accessibility based on what's important for that product. So accessibility is not this thing that you do in isolation. It's tied to the type of product you have. It's also tied to the kind of organization culture you have. What are some things that you can do? Is it more of a design-centric organization, more like engineering? And you can leverage those things. So I'll give you an example of something that I've never done. Let's say a newspaper website. There's no accessibility on it. Nobody knows how to do it. What do? Well, the product is meant for reading. So let's make sure that people can read. So the most important thing for a newspaper website might be really good text increasing or zoom functionality, really good typeface that is easy or easier to read, really good structure, what's a heading, what is a subsection, what is a, stuff like that. And perhaps keyboard accessibility is not as important. So I'll start with those things: type of product, type of organization you're in, and then there's no such thing as people having zero accessibility knowledge. On the flip side, there's no such thing as a completely inaccessible website.
Yeah.
And I always tell people, I'm fairly sure in whatever team, big or small, you might find someone who is passionate about something, even if it's tangential to accessibility, and they might be, passionate enough to do something about it. And I'll give you a quick example of this. I worked at TELUS Digital for a while. I kept having this thing going: Scotiabank, Facebook, banking, social media, telecom, Slack.
You've been around, man. You've been around.
E-commerce, or whatever Loblaw is nowadays. But at TELUS Digital, I found this designer who used to, as a student job, he worked on the golf course. I don't know what people do with golf clubs. Tune them, fix them, whatever. And then
not a golfer, I see.
No. And then one of his customers, he only had one hand, and he had to figure out how to build a sort of a prosthesis for his golf club so that he has a better time swinging. And then he became a designer. He was working at TELUS Digital. I was doing this whole advocacy thing, and then he became literally the most passionate designer about accessibility. And he started off as a junior designer. It would be very easy to ignore them or people like that, but shouldn't. I think you can always find people passionate about this.
Yeah.
And I think just being exposed to people, different people than you, is so important. Like, I'll tell you another quick little story. So when this whole COVID stuff started, I was Skyping with my grandma, who's 91. She's pretty old, right? She's a senior. She's got most of her faculties, but something happened with her Skype. She couldn't get it to work. So I tried to walk her through installing TeamViewer, just talking to her on the phone, and she was holding her phone to show me her screen. And it opens your eyes. As a designer, I've been using computers since I was 8, right? Like, it's just in my blood. And so you forget, right? And so I think it's important to go and observe, right? Watch people use your product, and see, and empathize, right? That's right. Design thinking. We're supposed to be all that hippie stuff, hippie dippy stuff, right? That's the real stuff,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where the value of user research comes in. And most places I've worked at, they have all these sort of demographics for research: this age, this gender, this experience, this level of computer knowledge, but not people with disabilities, or at least not as often as I would have wanted it to. And I mean, it's eye-opening. I put together sessions at different companies where all I did was I got one of my friends. In this particular case, he happened to be blind and a screen reader user, and I just asked him to come at the company and just do a quick demo, him using the product that we built, and just for people to hear the experience. And even the people who are, let's say, most ignorant about accessibility, they took it personally because that was their product and somebody had a hard time with their product. Yeah. And he was like, and they took it, and it became a mission. Like, yeah, I'm gonna fix this. Like, are you kidding me? I can't believe that. So he was very,
Good.
Observation testing always wins the day. It's probably, to me, the most powerful of all the testing that we do, as design UX designers and stuff, because it's just users do what you never expect them to do. You see things that you're not going to see in any other kind of test.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So how do you think? Because there's new legislation kicking in next year. Am I right about that? In Canada, right? 2021. What's the rule now? Because it's right now. I think it's government, right? If you're government, you got to be accessible, and they had a few gates, right? But I think 2021 is the final gate. Like, everybody's got to be accessible now, right?
Yeah. So this was staggered, but there's a big deadline. There's a big reporting deadline for December 2020. The work really should have started back in 2014. I was a few years ago. Time dilation with COVID feels like a million years ago, but I want to say maybe 2 years ago. I was on a subcommittee who was advising legislators for how to improve the AODA. So the legislation you mentioned is called AODA. And on this subcommittee, we were literally just talking about digital accessibility. Like you mentioned, there are different standards, like physical accessibility, transportation. And so the big deadline is December 2020 for reporting. But companies should have done accessibility much earlier, or they should have started with it. Now it's just about reporting. What have you done over the last 6 years or the last 3 years? And it's one level of WCAG. So WCAG has multiple levels, level A, double A, triple A. But you're reporting on single A at the end of the year. And then you are also supposed to be double A accessible the next day, literally January 1st, 2021. But you don't report on it until 3 years later. The problem with I have a very small contribution on the legislation, and I have a lot of issues with the companies that didn't really work on accessibility when they should have. But I have another issue with the legislation itself because it's very binary. You're basically reporting, are you compliant or are you not? And then if you're a company that has 100 websites, and let's say you forgot alt text on one image or one button out of 100 websites don't work, by law, you are reporting that you're not compliant. And then that to me, and the legislation was started being written in 2005, or sorry, I believe it was enacted in 2005. And that was a very different time. Today, we have anybody who has a website that is the core offering. So I'm not, talking about a manufacturing company who might have a website with some document with some pages there, but like Loblaw or any company where people have to go to the website to do stuff. Software doesn't work like that today. You're pushing code multiple times a day. You're pushing updates. You have releases. There's no binary, representation like this in any dimension of software. So I think the legislation is forcing people in some cases to adopt some bad habits, because right now everybody wants to do audits, and you do an audit, and an audit is a point in time, right? You audit a website on this day at this time, you had these accessibility issues, and then by the time you fix those, you had like 10,000 other releases if you're pushing code that often. And then what does that say? You might have an amazing accessibility experience, but you have some bugs, just like you have bugs for anything else, and you just have to go back and fix them. But that shouldn't be taxing. There's no way for any large enough organization to never have accessibility bugs, because that implies that you never have software bugs. You never have any bugs.
It's not realistic.
Yeah.
So what do you think? Are most companies ready? I have a sneaking feeling that they're not. Because you know how people are. They wait till the last bloody minute.
Sorry if I could say something. I might be incorrect, but I know in the States with the HIPAA Act there, with the healthcare software, the Obama government was throwing a lot of money at companies. This is the reason I know this is because when I was doing that WCAG testing, it was a requirement. So a lot of companies were creating products and that to get this funding as a business model. Even they were getting lots of money from the government just because, okay, well let's make a new product. And part of the requirement was meeting accessibility guidelines. Whether it was at different stages, like you said, the AAA, the single A, and double A. So it's.
Well, I think the Americans are a little ahead of us. They're about 10 years ahead. I think Bush won. Bush Senior signed the ADA in like early 90s. So obviously that didn't have any web stuff, but they were thinking the government, U.S. government, they're ahead of us, I think.
Oh yeah, for sure. I
You
think.
know?
Yeah, and it's also it's the I think that the different culture played into it
Yeah.
because the U.S. is a bit more litigious than Canada, and just the fear of getting sued was enough that it pushed people to do something about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, the ADA accessibility for no accessibility, well, something about disability.
Disabled Americans. Whatever. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. I'm
But
getting
that's
the-
how the TTC wasn't announcing subway stops until a blind lawyer sued them.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
I'm actually not a big fan of influencing change or bringing about change by forcing people.
Me
But on
neither.
the
Me
flip
neither.
side, actual people can't do basic things like transportation, and they're suffering because X company didn't prioritize accessibility, right? So
Yep.
Yeah.
It's a balancing act, right?
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be demanding, and sometimes if you legislate something, they'll just do the bare minimum, right?
Yeah, and to be honest, this is how I see compliance. The WCAG guidelines that we've mentioned a few times, to me, they're brick and mortar. They are generic. They don't tell you whether you can build a fully compliant experience and a really with really bad usability.
Yeah.
I'll actually give you an example for this.
Yeah.
At Slack, we had Slack has this channels list on the left side, and then the messages on the right side. So there are two panels, and on the left side, we this was a while ago. This is not the case in the current experience, but a while ago you could tab through all the channels. So they're links. They were properly built. You could tab to them. You could see where you are. By law, that's compliant. But then if you think of a keyboard user's experience, you have to tab how many ever channels you have to get to your messages. And then you switch a channel, and then you have to tab 100 times more to get back to your messages. So compliant, but experience is not great. It's similar to the building code. You can build compliance. You can have a shitty elevator to take people with wheelchairs up, but the elevator might be at the back of the building, and you have to go back through the alleyway to get there. And like, really, do I want to go in through next to the garbage bin? You have to go through next to the garbage bin to get to the elevator? No. So that's I think a good distinction to make.
That's a good point.
Sorry, go ahead, Dick.
Yeah, it's a good point. A distinction between just being compliant and doing a good job.
Yeah.
It's sometimes different because how do you can't get all those rules. You can't get that in a document, right? There's so many moving parts, and it's hard to document everything, right?
It must be give and take. Think of the battle between UX and usability and security, right? It's the same sort of, you pull from one, you lose from the other.
Right.
You can have a great user experience, but it might not be secure. You have awesome security, and the user experience goes down. I see this. Yeah. It's very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a perfect example where accessibility and security are at odds. And the example is CAPTCHAs, because CAPTCHAs are literally meant so that you can't use certain senses to decipher the CAPTCHA. So you have a CAPTCHA, which is an image, but it does not have alternative text, because if it were, all the crawlers would be able to pick that up, put it in, you're done. So it's literally discriminating between senses for security purposes, but it's disadvantaging people who don't have that particular sense.
Do some of those have sound now, or am I like where you click, you hear this instead? Is that Is that a thing? Yeah. Okay. I just wasn't sure. I was like, I thought there was. So.
Yeah, but that's not great either, because the sound is not clear sound. It's muffled. It's hidden in all kinds of ways.
Right.
You can hear songs behind the letters that are in the CAPTCHA. It's muffled, just like it's obfuscated, just like visually it is. So
that was that's an engineer's invention, man. A security engineer invented CAPTCHAs. There's no designers were involved in that. Because even when I can't use them, I got Good vision, fairly. I can't. I can never figure them out.
Yeah, I don't know. Is that an E or an?
Yeah, yeah, an M or a W. You know, it's messed up. But you know what? We have burned through an hour like so quick. So maybe we should wrap things up. Scott, do you have any more questions? I mean, we have an expert available here. If you had any,
Stop calling me an expert. I'm not an expert. I did this enough times that I can hopefully do a better, this iteration.
sure.
But don't call me an expert.
Okay. Well informed.
Okay.
Well
Thank you.
experienced.
Yeah, no questions. This has been very informative. I mean, it's good to know that some of the things we're doing that I'm doing are on track. So, or even what I learned in the past, it doesn't seem to have changed much. If anything, the industry's embracing it more, which is good, right? I mean,
Yeah.
like UX has been growing. If accessibility is growing, then that's good for product. So, or whatever you're working on.
Oh, I should add, I agree that it's been growing and it's been more visible and it's been more focus on it. But I should add something that just happened recently, I think yesterday. Twitter launched this new feature where you can send audio tweets. Um, it's not an alternative to text. It's literally just audio. And this is very, very useful for example, for people like my dad. Not that he would tweet, but he would much rather press a button, record an audio message, and send it. But what this does, of course, this leaves out people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And when your entire Twitter timeline becomes audio, you basically can't participate. So you're being excluded from arguably the biggest social media platform on the planet. And what came from that, there was quite a tweet storm. What came from that was that Twitter itself doesn't have an accessibility team. The accessibility work that has been done has been by basically volunteers from the company who do accessibility of the side of their desks. This is one of those examples where, technology kind of moves forward and there's new stuff on the market, but we keep forgetting that we're leaving some people behind.
So let's leave it with this. How do we get it? How do we fix that for good? How do you convince Jack Dorsey and the like to really take it seriously?
Well, to your point earlier, when we talk about diversity, the point of diversity is that people bring their lived experiences to a product, right? So that point of research, if you do just bare minimum research and say, does this work for everyone? And let's ask somebody who's younger, somebody who's older, somebody who's never used Twitter, and somebody who has a disability. Then you could immediately identify that, whoops, this is really discriminating against some people. The way you solve this is literally by being informed, and the way different companies get informed is in different ways. Research here's an example. There's some countries that have, as part of their accessibility legislation, they have it as an option or a strong recommendation that for government websites and stuff like that, you can release a product unless you are consulting with actual people with disabilities. So this is one of those basic things you can do. I wanted to add one other thing, that we're talking about disability and there are so many, and how can we ever stay on top of this? How do we build an experience that accounts for all this? I think this is where really the value of WCAG comes in, because that actually accounts for all of them, and it's guidelines. So if you're forgetting about deaf users and you go to WCAG, you can tell right away that there's a guideline in there that says if your product is using audio, you need to have an alternative medium like text or like something else. There are alternatives. So this may seem daunting for people who've never done accessibility, but everything starts from a set of guidelines. Either it's WCAG or what I've been doing to abstract into even fewer criteria that are based on WCAG. But you start with with something small. Like I was telling Scott earlier, depending on the product you have, the team that you have, the organization, you start with one thing. I have a newspaper website. I'll start with my accessibility thing to be readability, text and whatnot, and expand from there. So I think information is how we solve this.
Interesting.
Okay. Awesome. That's fantastic. Hey guys, I both appreciate a ton you guys coming on the show and having this great convo. I think I could probably go another hour, but I don't know. I'm not at the Joe Rogan level yet where we go for 3.5 hours and I keep people on, right? Maybe we'll build up to that and I'll bring you guys back again and we'll go for 2 hours maybe.
Yeah.
We can get real deep. I want to talk. I didn't get to talk about active perception. There was all these things I wanted to talk about, but an hour just goes like that, you know?
Yes.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I have to say I had a lot of fun. This was
Good.
way too organized for me. I thought I would just dial in and be like, "Hey, dudes, what's up?" And then
this is official.
Crap.
The Carmen Branje Show is the real deal.
Yeah, I feel like now I need to buy a green screen.
Hey, you know what? It's a sheet from Amazon. Oh, you can't see the waving, but it was like a $20 sheet off Amazon.
Awesome.
It's a shoestring budget here at the Carmen Branje Show.
Yeah. Low budget.
Low budget. Okay, gentlemen, I'll let you get to your evenings. Again, thanks so much. And I'll talk to you soon. George, hopefully I can see you at work soon if we ever get back into the office. But until then.
I know. Cool.
Yeah. Okay. See you guys later.
Have a good night.
Okay. Bye-bye. Alrighty. Screw just me. Okay, thank you everybody for watching the Carmen Branje Show. Please subscribe. It helps me out incredibly. And yeah, other than that, I'll see you at the next Carmen Branje Show.